Hi, guys. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, whatever time you're listening to this episode. My name is Emmanuel Molly, and welcome to the Grow Design Podcast. In today's episode, I have my dazzling co-host with me, Ini. Hi.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode and we're excited to be here.
Yeah, so much excited to have this episode today. And we are continuing the Growth Designers Playbook series. And joining us today is Alicia Cressall. She is a growth designer, an ex-growth designer at Parable. She has 9 years designing products and specialized in systems that put users first. In the last 3 years, she had focused on growth and marrying user needs with business value. When she's not designing, she has a deep knack for books and going out with a dog called Opie and also traveling. I've known her for over a year now, and she's been a very good inspiration to people like us who are getting started in growth design. Hi, Alicia.
Hi, it's so exciting to be here.
Yeah, good to have you once more. So before we dive deep into this episode, can you just give us a brief introduction about you and tell about your background, who you are?
Yeah, you covered a bit. I've been designing for about 9 years. And as you mentioned, I spent the last 3 years specializing in growth. And I've worked on teams where I'm the solo designer and I'm building a lot of things from scratch, which has been super fun and really interesting to do. But I've also been on larger teams where I'm doing more collaboration and feature contribution, contributing to design systems and things like that. But I really found my love in growth design, so I'm excited to be talking about it today.
So what would you say is the difference between designing at a large firm and a solo designer? Like, what are the peculiarities around that?
Yeah, when you're a solo designer, you have to make everyone around you who's not designers start to do design thinking, because the benefit of being on a design team is you get feedback from designers who understand the problems you're trying to solve. And it can be difficult for someone like a PM or a data scientist to come in and give or know how to give the right kind of feedback on something. But if you can sort of coach them and guide them into, what kind of feedback do you need? What phase of the project? Is it like really early concept? And then they become like super valuable assets, because not only have they learned how to give design feedback, but they come at it from their perspective. So I really love getting data scientist perspective, because they have a different view of users where they're like spending time looking at data, and we have the qualitative feedback a lot of the time, but getting the data scientist perspective can be really fun to get their different spin on like what a good UX might be. And I think that's the biggest difference, is like the kind of support and network that you have as a designer.
Absolutely. Okay, so what got you into design, or did you just have a knack for it and decide to pursue it?
It was very linear for me. I know a lot of people come in at different stages of their career, but for me, I actually studied graphic design in college, and it was really just exploring this creative side that I didn't know what to do with. Like, I didn't know what kind of career it could be or what it could turn into. And then as I was studying, I started to realize that, hey, I actually really like this. And then once we got into learning, going from like print design and branding to web, I was like, oh, I like coding too. That's really fun. And so my career kind of went from working on marketing websites and that side of things, and gradually moving into product and then growth, which kind of incorporated both the marketing and product experience that I had in the past.
Amazing. So can you describe your journey to becoming a growth designer, and what really inspired you to just say, okay, this is the right path for me right now as a designer?
Yeah, I fell into it by accident. I can remember when I started interviewing for the role at Parable, I was like, what is growth design? Like, what does that mean? And I Googled it, and I think I just kind of glanced at the first thing that came up, and it was like, oh, marketing and product. And I went, great, like that's what I've done. That sounds like a great fit for me. And then once I got into the role, I had to actually figure out what that meant, because there wasn't anyone else doing it at the company. And it's getting better, especially with podcasts like this, but growth had often been spoken about from the lens of either product management or marketing. And so growth design, there wasn't a lot of resources. And that's why I think this podcast is so special because anyone who's like where I was, like, hey, what is a growth designer? Now you can actually find things about what that means. But for me, it just it worked out perfectly to figure out that like, that is actually what I want to be doing.
Quite interesting. Yeah, I understand that you currently offering coaching services like to designers who are getting started with growth. Can you share some tips on how a designer can position themselves and prepare for a growth focused role, maybe seeking for their first role as a growth designer? I'm just curious if there are unique strategies as designers that could help you stand out amidst the competition when you're trying to get that your first role as a growth designer.
Yeah, I think that the first role is tricky because you often can't show what metrics you're moving. I think designers often have a hard time getting access to data and being truly data driven. And that's a big part of growth design. So it's difficult if you can't show that. But I think you can spin things in the way that you speak about it. So like, did you take an experimental mindset or approach to how you design something? Did you influence the way that something was released so that you could test it? And what did you learn? And really taking advantage of the opportunities to bring that kind of continual improvement that a lot of designers do naturally, but really highlighting that kind of mindset that you have, because I think designers are very adaptable and we can learn to be a growth designer and anybody can do that, but showing that you have the interest to move in that direction and you're open to that kind of way of working, I think will make the biggest impact.
Amazing. I think you kind of tell more about the mindset. When you don't have those data, you don't have a previous portfolio that talks about growth. So you kind of highlighted how you should talk in terms of how you've applied the mindset as a growth designer on a project that is not kind of growth focused. Like maybe you did some iteration and everything, but can you be a little bit specific now during the interview process, right? When you interviewed, what could really stand you out in terms of the ingredient of your portfolio?
This isn't coming from the experience of me doing it and getting a job in that, because I wasn't specifically looking for growth design, but I think if I was looking at portfolios, I think something that would stand out to me is if I got to the end of a case study and they said, here's what I want to do next to build on it based on what I've learned, or here's what I would have done differently, and showing that like learning. And again, it's that growth mindset, but like, I think talking about it openly and having that humility to be able to say like, and maybe we didn't know how this turned out, or here's how I would find out if we had the opportunity. Like, I know I don't have this data, but this is what I would look for. And I think there's ways that you can talk about it to bring in those elements, even if you don't have it.
Great. Absolutely interesting. I like that. So, looking at your journey at Parable, right? And as the first hired for growth design, what were your initial responsibilities or expectation when you got hired as a growth designer?
Yeah, it was kind of messy at first. There was the expectation that I would work with marketing on the marketing website, but also that I would work on the product. But I sat on a separate growth team that was just marketing and sales, and that's all at that time that was on that team. And so getting buy-in from engineers was challenging because they had different priorities because they were on a totally different team. And so initially I focused a lot more on the marketing side and learning about our users. And then eventually I was able to kind of like build that trust and that experimentation process with the engineers. But it took a fair amount of time. I'm going to say like roughly a year before we were able to really start actually working in a growth way.
Interesting. What were your expectations like? What was at the back of your mind when you like, okay, you're going to be a growth designer? What were you expecting?
The big concern for me when I started was I didn't want to only be working on marketing. I wanted to make sure that there was that product side as well. And I didn't have a ton of expectations into what that would look like, but I did hope that it would be a bit more collaborative than it was at the start. And so that disconnect between the two teams was really challenging. And I found I needed to define what growth was when I didn't even know what it was at first. So I needed to kind of create those expectations because they didn't exist before.
All right, great. So in terms of practical steps, what are the steps that you took understanding the company's products, market, and user base at first, coming in as the first hire?
Yeah, like I said, I partnered very closely with marketing. And so I actually redesigned the marketing website. It was one of my first major projects. And that gave me a sense of how marketers thought about the funnel. And it allowed me to dive into that. Even though I wasn't working on the product side of it, it helped me understand what marketing was doing around the funnel, even like email workflows and sign up experiments and things like that. But then I also would jump into any user research that was happening. I love user interviews anyway. So there was a few projects going on where that was happening and I'm like, yeah, I'll help facilitate or take notes or whatever. And then you get that real user feedback really quickly. At Parable, we also had a customer support rotation where the sales team members would rotate through, would take turns doing customer support. And I joined on that because I was like, yeah, I want firsthand feedback. So I'd spend a week every so often doing support. I'd get the feedback. I'd understand like what are the big pain points for our users. And then I was able to bring that back to product team or sometimes even the marketing team and use that. It was fantastic.
Absolutely. I think that's great. Doing user research and joining the customer support team. I think I like that. I think I'll do that more often also.
Just speaking about the marketing side of things, because I worry that sometimes designers coming into this may not understand that there are marketing elements to the role also. Right. I'm curious to see in what capacity did you work with marketing and what were the actual tasks that you carried out that were growth related, so to speak?
Yeah, the first thing I did was help to define our branding. And a big part of that was like, how do we talk about ourselves to our users and how do we show up? So a big thing we needed to decide was Parable's a product for teams. Are we talking to the teams or the team leads? And figuring out like who is our audience. And I mean, that wasn't usually my call to make, like the marketers are deciding that, but it was really helpful to be a part of those conversations and then figuring out, okay, now that we know this, how does that impact the visual branding, which I worked on as well. And that kind of like slowly trickled into then working on actual growth products and like how a certain part of the funnel can impact the business. I'm a big fan of like being close to other roles so you get a bit of osmosis of just like hearing them talk about things. It helps you figure out that mindset so then when you go to bring it into your own work, you have a bit of an understanding not only of the language to communicate with them, but then also how to incorporate like, okay, I'm doing onboarding. Marketing has a set of emails that they're working on. I need to keep that in mind to make sure that those two things are in sync.
Exactly, because I'm just curious also, you mentioned you worked on visual branding, for example, right? So how much of this there's a bit of a discourse currently around specialization, non-specialization of designers, that back and forth, like, oh yeah, we need to be more generalists. And in this might feel like putting you on the spot, but I'm curious to know your thoughts on that, especially since you've been in that scenario before. Where do you stand? And based on your experience, what would you say to that or contribute to that discourse?
I am definitely a generalist personally, and I love it. I've picked up front-end development, and in growth, I've started looking at data analysis, and it's just so much fun, and I love the variety. And I think for me, it allows me to bring a lot to my role of like understanding different parts of the business. But I do think there is a place for specialization as well, and the two can work really well together. I worked really well and very closely with more of a specialist designer at Parable. And so he'd go really deep into a feature and expanding on what that feature was and adding more onto it. And he was very, very good at that. And for me, I sometimes get impatient and I'm like, I want to move on to a new experiment and learn new things. And so having someone who can like go really deep on a thing and wide with it is still super valuable to a business. So I think there's a place for both.
Yeah, there's always a place for both and there's a need for balance. I think I also say I'm proud to be a journalist. So I think
I think we all are. Yeah, because I mean, just listening to you talk about it, it was that thing with onboarding. Like, we also just need to realize that everything needs to work in tandem, right? Like, I've contributed on projects where I led the rebrand of the entire company, and then moving on from just the rebrand, that means we're launching like email experiments to test copies, subject lines. I learned so much about like growth hacking from a marketer's perspective, and then being able to take that into the product thinking too. I just think it's so important for designers to realize that with growth, especially, it would mean a lot more collaboration with other roles. And that's very important to how you work. So
Yeah.
Absolutely.
When you are making a food, you have a little bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of that. It all makes your soup or your food really delicious. So I think it's good to be a generalist. Just putting that out there. Have a bit of everything. Yeah, so going back to your journey, what were the biggest lesson you learned during your initial month as a growth designer?
Yeah, there's two things. The first one is just that growth design is its own thing. And that was a journey in learning that at the beginning. But figuring out what it was, I also realized that the way I had been working and the way I liked to work had a name. And it wasn't just like me being a little different from some other product designers. It was like, actually, I did have a growth mindset all along and understanding what that was. And then the second thing, once I started diving into data analysis a bit more, I learned how powerful and like empowering it can be to be getting into data as a designer, because we often use like qualitative user feedback, and that's really great. But once you can combine that with quantitative data, and it really helps you get buy-in from the team. For me, it's like actually really inspiring. I get a lot of ideas from looking at data and seeing where things are going wrong. And so that kind of created a shift for me when I was able to incorporate that into my work.
Interesting. So, looking at your journey now, what do you think would distinguish a successful growth designer to make impact on the organization? Like,
I think it's that comfort level with experimentation. And I think that's sometimes the difference between a growth designer and someone who's just doing product design, is feeling comfortable and okay with like, I'm going to work quickly and it's not going to be perfect, and having that mindset of we're going to move fast and I don't know what the answers are. So there's like a vulnerability in that as well, of like, I could be wrong. Like this might not work, and you need to be okay with that. And sometimes that can be really hard because we have a lot of like intuition and gut feelings, especially if we got a little bit of qualitative feedback that might confirm that, but then you can still be wrong. And so you need to be comfortable with that discomfort, I guess, of like the unknowns.
all right, as a designer, getting comfortable with experimentation is really good, right? But in terms of pushing metrics or making impact, you want to ensure that your voice is heard, you pushing metrics and everything. So, in your experience as a growth designer, what were the things that you did to ensure that my impact is being felt?
I created an intentional shift at one point where I wanted to learn about data analysis and really improve those skills. I always had a curiosity, but I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to go about it. And I was very fortunate that at Parable, everyone could have access to use Amplitude for event tracking. And so I could just go in and play, and like, I have a random question. I don't need to ask the data scientist to like help me with this. I'm just curious question. I could go in and play myself. And so what that turned into was, when I started designing, I would ask questions of myself of like, how are we going to track this? How are we going to find out if this is successful? What do I need in terms of like, maybe it's just like, I want an event on this button, and asking the engineer to include that. And then that kind of worked backwards into, once I had that comfort level with knowing what kinds of things we would want to track, then at the beginning going, okay, what do we not know that we want to find out? And thinking about making design decisions around metrics in a way, like, how are we going to find out if this is successful? How are people going to find it in the first place? That was one thing on a project I work on, is like, okay, we have this feature that we think will impact expansion, but it's new, and how are people going to discover it? And so we needed to think about that in the first place. So we didn't have any past metrics to go on because it was brand new, but how are we going to get that information?
Amazing. So I just need to just affirm what you said in terms of what I think two things I learned is be curious, how you're curious about what data analysis and how you could just infer, you could take decision based on data and everything, and also taking initiatives. I think those are two things that really stand out to me. Yeah. Back to you, Ine.
So about the data, I'm curious now because my mind's like working as you're speaking. So, in a brand new team where you're still trying to figure out how to analyze it, can you go a bit more into a bit more depth about what key activities you actually took for a company that does not have data when you're still in that early stage? How are you able to then get into like that the level of depth that you did at Parable? Where'd you start from? Where'd you find that first thread to pull?
I think using that onboarding as an example, before I did like a full audit and I went through like all the steps and looked at the data, we had a larger question of people are signing up and people are converting, but the middle, we were running out of people to convert. And so something was happening where people weren't becoming sticky, they weren't onboarding. And so we knew we had that question, and it was, how do we figure out what's happening? Where are people dropping off? And so it actually started with user research initially and figuring out like, because we didn't know, we were just like, I don't know. We don't know anything about a lot of these users that like aren't getting to the enterprise level. And so there were discussions, and I spoke to existing users, and then I had people who had never seen the product so they could come in like fresh eyes, like what's wrong? And there was a lot of confusion. And it was super helpful to kind of figure that out. And so we had like a few quick wins from that. And then I think being able to advocate for like, okay, I want to be able to look at this more in depth, and what do we have available to do that? And our amplitude setup actually didn't work very well. What I ended up doing was I created a whole flow from scratch, because our amplitude setup, you can look at a user journey in Amplitude, and the problem was we had all of our screens were like view to page was the event name. But then I didn't know what they were viewing. I was just like, I know they loaded something, but like what page? And so that would just show up over and over again. And so it was not helpful. And so I went in and I used a funnel, which is not what I wanted because that's linear. But I would go in and say, all right, this user of this kind, because we had users who were signing up initially and then invited users. So there was two kind of segments that I was looking at and figuring out, okay, did they do this thing or did they do this thing? And I would just like change the events and look at like the conversion rate for those specific events. And it became really manual and really long and not good. Yeah, it was like really big and like super helpful and like valuable to do that. But it was a case where like the implementation was not perfect and it definitely needed work. Does that kind of answer what you're looking for?
Yeah, it does. And yeah, I guess it does. So how much of investment, so to speak, like team effort went into that kind of scenario? Because I'm imagining you probably had to do a lot of like manual data extraction, so to speak, by yourself, not since Amplitude was not that helpful, right? And then did you run into some challenges in figuring out the data? You've mentioned Amplitude not helping, but then how did you understand, interpret? Did you have conversations with the data team? And what was the level of investment across board?
Yeah, small. It was mostly just me trying to figure it out. And I think this was part of my like data journey initially too, was like, when I first started with Amplitude, I was like, this is what I'm seeing. And I would ask people who had spent more time in that, like our head of growth, she was like very good at working with data. And then our data scientist, and be like, am I reading this right? And I would ask that a lot. Like, this is what I see. Is this right? And they would sometimes say, actually, like, you need to adjust this like filter or whatever to get a more accurate number. And so doing that over time allowed me to get to the point where I could go in and do that onboarding analysis on my own, and then I put it all together and I shared it with the team, and they can pick it apart and say, actually, like I'm not sure about this part of it, like maybe let's go back and check that again. And that's part of the like, you know, being open to being wrong a lot of the time is like, I know it's imperfect, this process, we didn't have all the tools in place, so come check my work.
Yeah, amazing. That's that having that humility, it's very key. It's very key. Yeah.
So let's dive into some PLG, right? What is PLG as a basis? And then from a designer's perspective, because there is many times, I remember a recent conversation with a founder who was trying to understand what growth design was. It was like, hang on, it's growth hacking, I know. What is growth design, right? So talk to us from perspective of PLG. How is that different from all the other strategies that have been used to drive product growth?
So like the other strategies that I think of when I think about, like, if someone's not doing product-led growth, what are they doing? And it's often like sales-led or marketing-led. And the thing with that is design's often not involved in those things, especially sales-led. Is like, it's in a larger company, designers aren't talking to sales team members. And so then when you shift to product-led, anyone who's working on the product is now involved in the growth. And that means designers now have the ability to create business impact that didn't exist before in a sales-led kind of environment. And so the difference is like you go from nothing to something in terms of like, now I suddenly have the ability to like do all these things and show the impact that I have. I think I only answered half of your question. What was the
answer? So, so yes, you answered that part. So what then is product-led growth?
Yeah, I am far from an expert, I think, on product-led growth in general, but it is using the user experience to increase the user adoption and the potential for revenue that a company has. And I think that like UX part of it is so closely tied, and why growth design needs to go with growth hacking, because the strategy then and the user experience really go hand in hand.
So as a designer, I mean, talk to us, how do you approach then incorporating PLG principles into the products that you work on?
Yeah, for me, it's when you have the opportunity and you can put data-driven design actually into practice. A lot of companies talk about it and they say, yeah, we do it, we're looking for it, but then they don't have the things in place to actually do it. And I think being able to apply data to your design process is so empowering, and you can ask questions of the product and of users, like, why aren't users getting to this one thing? Why are they dropping off at this other thing? What design possibilities are there because this thing is happening? And so you can get a bit of a more holistic view of the product and the product's growth once you can start bringing those in. When you start thinking about what the possibilities are, you get into the realm of the growth hacking stuff a little bit, of like, what things can we try? What have other people done? What kind of tactics are there to try to improve this metric? But you're bringing it with like the UX lens and like, trying to avoid dark patterns and things like that.
You sound like you've been opportune to work across the entire spectrum, like from acquisition all the way to monetization. I'm just curious what part of it has been your favorite, so to speak, or a period where, like, was it, if you were working on monetization or working on acquisition, what part of it struck a chord with you the most or pushed you even more as a designer?
I really loved working on conversion and monetization. And part of that is because it's really easy to see the results. You go, oh, someone upgraded, like we had a Slack bot that would just like ping us like, this team upgraded, and you just like celebrate it every time. And the more that happens, it's like, hooray. And you get this like instant gratification that's really, really fun. And then it's also like you're making the company money. Like that's like a very tangible value that you're bringing.
Yeah.
And so it can be really fun to work on that. But then on the flip side, like acquisition is really hard. And so it's like, there's really interesting problems there, but it's like, yeah, we were looking at expansion metrics, and it was like, why? We don't know why these are going down, what's seasonal, what's not, like, and it's really hard to attribute what you're doing to those metrics, which is like, I love big challenges, so it's fun that way, but like the instant gratification of monetization was like the best part for me.
I love that. Yeah, no, I agree with you on acquisition, because it's that thing where there are just so many factors. Because I remember part of the whole collaboration with marketing on my side was we had over 20 plus landing pages, and I had to monitor the metrics every week across every single one of them. And then it's just like the minute you're starting to celebrate, like, oh, finally, my numbers are looking green. SEO is working. Organic growth is looking good. And then come next week, everything is in red. And it's just like, now you have to start figuring out, because then you've got like a VP of Ops sending you a message, what's going on with this week's numbers? Like, who knows? Maybe it's this, it's that. So yeah, acquisition really tests everything you've got, but it's fun sometimes.
Yes.
Okay. We've talked so much about collaboration across teams so far. And when it comes to that relationship between designers product managers and engineers, as usual, there's quite a bit of discourse around this also, right? Where it's like, I've seen all sorts. On one hand, I've seen conversations where it's like, oh yeah, it's the PM that should lead that relationship and in defining, just because they see end to end and across board. But then when it comes to that collaboration, how important is this? And what happens when an organization sees the importance in PD working in tandem, truly in tandem together?
I think that's where the magic happens, is when they can work together. I'm always a big advocate of that. A lot of it is trust, and like your PM should be able to trust you to have an input and to make some decisions on what's happening, because otherwise they're just gonna like micromanage and dictate, like, this is what we're working towards, this is what I want you to do. And some companies work like that. Personally, I would hate it because I have an interest in like, what is the strategy, why are we doing the thing, and also like, what data do we have to prove that this is the right thing that we should be working on. And I think in PLG, because it's so closely tied to the user experience, designers need to be a part of that conversation. Some product managers, they have user information and they know, but they don't have that experience. That's a little bit different than just like listening to what users have to say. There's like the design thinking element of like, how are people going to move from one thing to the next, that product managers are sometimes missing. And if you can build that relationship where you're sharing your expertise with your PM, they're going to start seeking that out. And so they will come to you and start asking like, hey, what do you think about this? How are we going to do this thing? Do you want to make a call on this thing? And it creates this dynamic where now you're partners. You know, your PM's not dictating anymore. You can be partners in like how you decide the strategy for the experiment that you might be working on. And it's great if you can also bring engineers into that and say, all right, we have this idea. Can we build this in an experimental way? How would we do that? What are the limitations? Because that's obviously going to come into your design process as well. And so it can be really helpful to have that full rounded partnership. And I often think of design as like the center of a Venn diagram, you know, when there's like all the circles and you have the part that comes together in the middle, where like you have product management and engineering and user value and business impact, and it's all around. And design has the ability to bring all of those pieces together into a solution. And so it helps to have like a little bit of knowledge from each of those people and bringing it into your design process.
I love the imagery around the Venn diagram. To just challenge you slightly on that, then, I did see another article recently that was like the author wrote about being tired of design, and more from a perspective of we think the world revolves around us type of scenario. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that, where on one hand, you're expected to collaborate and be generalist or be specialist or be this and be collaborative, be kind enough, but yet stand your ground and then know about business impact. And at what point do these things begin to get too much? And what's your advice to designers who might be listening and just find themselves perhaps on one side, they're not being listened to, or design is not being prioritized within their organizations, or designers who are suddenly thinking, oh my God, do I now need to learn how to code? Do I need to go to business school? I mean, there are all sorts of advice out there right now.
I've definitely felt the overwhelm of like, for a long time, people were like, designers need to know how to code and designers need to know psychology. And then in growth, designers need to know about data and business impact. And it's like, now I'm doing everything. I'm doing everyone's job. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And it can be really overwhelming. And I hit a point where I was like, all right, I don't need to be the expert on that thing. I need to know enough to be able to communicate with the expert. And that's their job to be the expert. And then set those limits for yourself. As a generalist, it's hard because you're just like, I want to dive into this thing. But you need to kind of, I think, be firm on those limits of like, this is how far I'm going to go, or this is the goal I want to get to, and then I'm done. You know, then I know it. And maybe you pick up another one later on, but you don't go so deep that you're suddenly like spending more time on a different area. That is going to make your design suffer in a way, because now you're not focusing on your core value add to the company. I've definitely felt the not being listened to aspect. I think that can be really tricky as designers because developers are often louder. There's more of them. They're heard more. And so it gets prioritized very easily. And it can be really hard for designers to feel like they have a seat at the table and they're going to be considered in the process. And I think a big part of that, for me, my approach is in relationship building with the other people. So with PMs or with the people who are making the decisions, if I don't know them very well, I like to have a one-on-one of just like, let's get to know each other. And then the benefit for you is you get to get a sense of how they think about things, so that if when you get feedback or when you need to approach them about something, you kind of know what they might be looking for, what their thought process might be. But I think it's that like trust building, so that when you do speak up, there is like oh, I know that this person thinks about this, or I know that this person cares about what I'm doing. And so you're going to be heard a little bit more.
So that brings us then into when you're thinking about common challenges, right, that designers face with PLG. What are some of those challenges and how do you go about addressing them?
I mean, we've talked a lot about experimentation, and I go back to that because I think that the people who struggle with growth design, it's around that area and being able to take something that's ambiguous and it potentially stays ambiguous and being okay with that. And I tackle that by making the solutions as small as possible so that you don't get too stuck in the weeds about parts of the experience that maybe like don't matter as much for the first version or won't give you the information that you need. And so really paring things down to be able to learn quickly, and then saving expansion on that for later. You know, you can jot down your ideas if you're really excited, but just like save that until you have the information. And then the second thing is like the organizational side of like access to data, because there are a lot of companies that like don't have their data set up in a way where anyone can just go in and find answers for themselves. And that's a really tricky place to be when you want to be able to have a business impact, because you don't have that information. And it's hard to solve. I think that relationship building again is going to be really helpful with that, because usually there's someone who has some information, whether it's like a manager who knows the budget, even, you know, you have that, or marketing teams who know like what their sign up rates are. And then if you're lucky to have a data scientist that you can go and ask questions to and bring all of those things together where you don't have access, but other people do. And then maybe as you get that information, you can create an opportunity with those people to advocate for designers having access. Like, I want to track events on these things. How can I do that? And you kind of create that desire for that information with those people.
Yeah, I think my last question before I swing back to Emmanuel will be to trace down the idea of MVPs, right? So there's this thing where on one hand, it's important to be able to ruthlessly prioritize, and just as a growth designer, it's speed, right? That you're trying to get as much experiments going and things like that. On the other hand, how much of MVPs? Because then sometimes I've seen scenarios where companies get stuck in MVP mode and it's just one MVP on top of the other. And something then happens and all these MVPs come crashing down. Well, not quite literally, but yeah. How do you find the balance between that of just making sure you're not building a house of cards, really?
I think that's really challenging, and it's something that came up at Parable. I'm going to say we didn't actually come up with a solid solution, but I have some thoughts. I can share the ideas that came to mind for me. Is that similar to your generalist and specialist kind of balance? I think there is a balance between running quick experiments and doing like deeper, broader work. And the tricky part is deciding when to do what. So is this a place where we're just like trying to find out if this has value, or is this a thing where like quality is going to be the driver of adoption? And I think my instinct is like, go for quality when you already have the validation and you can say, we know that there's a market for this thing, and now we can expand and really go deep on like, how do we innovate in this area, and how do we create something really unique and beautiful and a great user experience. But if you can do all of that, but if you don't know if it's going to work, like, you've wasted a lot of time. And so it's that balance of like, when asking yourself, like, is this a time where we don't know and we need information, or do we already have like really good signal about this thing and we can spend the time and invest in doing that?
That's a really good one. Thank you very much for that.
Looking at product leading growth for businesses and for companies, are there design considerations that are unique to that strategy of product leading the growth of a business or of an org?
I was going to say that I think the user focus, but that's not to say that marketing and sales don't focus on the users. I think they focus on users in a different way. So designers are always going to be focusing on the experience. And I think something like sales is probably focusing on the end goal. Like, did you get to the thing that you wanted? Yeah, great. Okay, now pay us. Where in product-led growth, it's the process. Are you getting things along the way? Are you getting the value? Are you getting what you need? Are you adding more people? And so it's a bit more continuous, I think, in the process.
What are key design considerations unique to PLG that you keep in mind during your product design process?
Yeah, I mean, for me, coming from like product to growth, it was like switching to that experiment mindset where I would sometimes see designers who are like, I want to iterate it on a thing, and you might need to do like one change, but then you see all these other things. You're like, well, I could make that better, and that would be an improvement, and I can make these other 5 things better. And we want to iterate and we want to make things better, but if we're going to run an experiment, it can make things really muddy if I've made like 50 different changes and now we don't know which one actually contributed to like our metric growth or going the other way. So learning when to stop yourself, I think, is an important consideration of like, if I have an A/B test, like we're testing this one thing and I can't get too carried away or too excited.
Looking at an example of successful PLG implementation you've done at your company, I assume, I know that Parable is product-led. Can you share an example of implementations you've done where design kind of plays a crucial role to driving user adoption and growth?
I mean, the collaboration really comes into everything. So it was tricky to me to think of a good example where like design really like stood out as a driver. But the one that comes to mind is we were building out a kind of team recognition feature that we were calling Kudos. And it was very new to the product. Parable is all about team meetings. And so bringing in Kudos, it was a question of, does this live separately? Is it within the meetings? Is it like a Slack integration? What does this look like? It was initially proposed by a data scientist, and he had this idea of what it would look like. And then I was working on something else at the time. The engineer came in and he's like, how about a form? And then the CEO came in and was like, what about this other thing? And this was all happening in Slack. It was just a giant thread of like all these ideas of what it could be. And then I needed to come in and step away from what I had been working with. Okay, pause. We need some design thinking here of like, how are we going to define this thing and where are we going to start? And so this is the part where I think design had the crucial role, was actually in the design thinking phase. And so I stepped back and said, all right, there are 2 things that we need to know. We need to know, how are people going to discover this because it's brand new? And then how are we going to test if it's actually providing value? Because that was the goal of doing this in the first place. And so what we ended up doing was including it in the core functionality in the meeting features within Parable. And it was just an emoji reaction. People were already doing that. So now you react with a heart and you get a little notification that says you gave kudos. And now you know, okay, it did something different. And that person would also get a notification. So-and-so gave you kudos for this thing. And then how we're going to test that was like, is the use of the emoji increasing? So are people doing this more and more now that they've figured out that it does something? And then what I wanted to do was have a qualitative aspect, because we didn't have a lot of ways to find data on this. So if people are doing this, say maybe 3 times, so at that point they've seen it, it's probably intentional. And then we can send them an email and say, what did you think? Is this valuable for you? Do you want this? Do you want more? Should we keep building on it? Do you want to use a different emoji? We thought about like, maybe you have an inside joke and you want to have like a random emoji that represents kudos for your team. And maybe you have it, you do want to have it integrated with Slack, but like all of that can come later once we figure out like what the value is for our users.
I love that. And you know how you were talking about everyone just piling in suddenly on what this could evolve into. Makes me curious and wonder about your experiment strategy. When you're thinking about laying out a roadmap for experiments, did you have like bank of possible ideas to experiment on? And if you did have that, how often did you update that And what was your approach towards updating it? Was it whenever inspiration struck, or you were actually doing audits? Like, yeah, I'm curious.
This is a process that our head of growth set up within our squad. So Parable works in trimesters, and each trimester we would redo our company strategy. And so leadership would kind of come up with a proposal of here's what we should focus on, and then the squads kind of like divvied up the work into just like what kind of felt like it made sense. And so we would have a different focus, whether it was on conversion or expansion or whatever it might be. So once we have that focus as a squad, we would spend time coming up with what kind of specific goals we wanted to look at, like X number of conversions, for example, or this amount of MRR increase or things like that. And then as a squad, we would brainstorm ideas for how we could get there. And so it was very collaborative in that way. And there was a time where I created a user journey, and we used that as our like basis of like, all right, this is our point of focus, and we'll brainstorm around that. And sometimes it was more broad because we just didn't quite know yet. And then we would prioritize that later based on effort and risk. So we would kind of vote on those two things and then prioritize our backlog that way. But then if something came up while we were doing the work, maybe one experiment was released and we learned something and we want to add something new, you can always add that to the backlog again, and you can, you know, add your risk and your effort thing, and it could move to the top. So that could be the next thing we're working on. It just kind of depends on, you know, ideas can come at any time, and making space for that to kind of flow into, you know, maybe there's a better idea that comes later, and the timing of it shouldn't matter.
That's good. Thank you.
So looking at design decisions, how do you measure the effectiveness of your design decisions in terms of the PLG levers like user activation, retention, and virality?
I think there's two sides for designers. There's the start of the process and the end when you're reviewing it later. So at the start, I'm often thinking about what do we know and what do we not know? What are the gaps where we're missing information for some reason, whether like the data just doesn't exist or we haven't been tracking it in a way that's useful or whatever that might be. And then as I'm designing, I'm thinking about how can we get that information, assuming we need it for that particular experiment. And I'll discuss that plan like with an engineer, like, hey, we might need some new events for these things, and then bringing in the PM and sometimes a data scientist to be like, how can we analyze? I have this idea, and then it's that checking in again of like, does this make sense? Is this actually going to give us the information that we need? And then you can come back to that later and go, now I actually have the tools to analyze this because we planned for it at the beginning, whether that's like a data scientist coming in and giving the results, or are you actually being able to dive into it yourself? Either way, but it's like having that curiosity about finding information that you may not have that helps you kind of see the results of it more clearly later.
Yeah, definitely. So considering what you need to know and what gap that you need to fill, then that gives you the meter to measure if the effectiveness of your design decision was really fulfilled. Yeah, I think I agree with that. So I read one of your newsletters this morning from the growthdesigners.co, and if you're listening to this podcast and you are aspiring to be a growth designer and you're not on that community, I think you are missing out a lot. So just do well to check growthdesigners.co and join the community. It's really a very, very big community of growth designers with the same mindset, with the same challenges, with the same thoughts, sharing their ideas out there. So do well to join. So I read through the newsletter today, which was all about limit usage, and more of the thing that stood out to me was you talking about the cake model. You talked about the cake model of experiments. Yes. So can you walk us through that model? What is it about, and how does it really enhance your experimentation?
Yeah, it was really fun. I'm not sure if our head of growth came up with this or if she found it somewhere else, but we actually called ourselves the Cupcake Squad. But the whole idea, yeah, it was really fun. And the whole idea is you can have like a cupcake, a birthday cake, or a wedding cake. And so it's like, what is the size of the thing you're building? And so as we were brainstorming experience, we would actually say, is this a cupcake or a birthday cake or a wedding cake? Or this is a cupcake, but what would the other kinds of cakes be for this thing? And so as part of that, like, what is the icing and what is the, I don't know, what kind of sponge is it or whatever, and that's like, what are the core things that we need to have, like what are the features and what is the impact, for example. And so for us, we use that cake model as like how we constantly ask ourselves, how can we make it smaller? Because often like you come up with this idea and it is like we come up with convoluted, complex things a lot of the time. And so the kudos example I shared before, I came up with the 3 different kinds of cakes for it. And then we were working on the cupcake version and the developer messaged me on Slack and I was like, hey, I think we can make this smaller. And then it started a whole discussion. Yep, let's remove this. Let's do this instead. Remove that. And we released that really fast because we were able to do that. And at that point, we had really built the practice about thinking about it in this way.
So the idea of the cake model is just to help you to be able to consume that idea in a much simpler way that you can release faster, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely, yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
I think I feel like there's something to be said for the way different teams, like things just come up that people use. So for example, the guy was describing how they prioritize experiments or decisions around experiments, and it's almost like $100. So you've got the $100 idea basically, and you have to spend this $100 across the ideas. Are you gonna go big and invest like $99 and $1 on a smaller one, or are you gonna spread it out over 20s or 5s or whatever it is? And they were saying that as much as possible, what they often saw was that many people would choose to really bet big on certain ideas, as opposed to spreading the money out. So it's just always fun to hear these different examples of how teams break things down or prioritize activities. It's so great. So I'm curious about those experiments. And in the newsletter, you had 3, what size of cakes they were, and then tell us more about these experiments and which one won and what was the purpose. Why were you experimenting in the first place?
So the 3 experiments were template limits, which was limiting the amount of free templates for the free tier. And then the second was history limit. So you could see your meeting history for all time previously in Parable. And so we added a limit. So for the free tier, it's only 30 days. And then the third one was a team limit, which was a limit that was a soft limit. Like on our pricing page, you would say like free tier, you get 2 free teams. But there was nothing in the product that stopped you from creating more. We wanted people to like get sticky and create adoption. But then sales would come in, oh, you have 15 teams. Do you want to upgrade? Because you're clearly getting value out of the product. And so the hypothesis there was, what happens if we start doing some of that programmatically in the product? So that one was a bit of a bigger cake because it was a little bit more complicated, and it was a lagging indicator because we would wait until an organization had created 3 teams and those 3 teams were active before we kind of did anything about it. So it's something that you only hit after a certain amount of time. So what we ended up seeing was our team limits, which was our biggest lift and the biggest chance for churn, because we had a hard limit. Like if you have 3 active teams, you're actually locked out of the product. That's what happens, is like you get a warning, you have like 30 days and it's like, you should upgrade, you're going to get locked out, you've gone over, and then you do get locked out. And so there's the chance that people will just like, well, I'll just go back to like Excel for my retro or whatever they were doing before. And so that was the biggest concern we had with that. And we saw both sides of the scale. We saw a lot of conversion from that because people were like, I love Parable, I don't want to lose it. And then on the other side, we did see a lot of churn because it was a very risky thing. If you didn't have buy-in from your company or your team actually wasn't as sticky as we thought, then people are just going to leave. And so we ended up rolling that back because we already had the soft limit that sales was kind of working towards. And we realized that our top of funnel wasn't growing quick enough to support something with that much churn. And then the second, template limits, was one that was also very successful. It was actually, I think, our most successful conversion lever. But because it's a limit that you can hit right away, like you can hit it as soon as you view the product, you start seeing your limits of what templates are available, we started to suspect that it was impacting stickiness. So as stickiness was starting to kind of slow down, we're like, could this be because you're seeing a limit so early on? And so that one, we actually decided to retest it. We reduced the number of paid templates so that there was more available for free. You could kind of kick the tires a little bit more, and we wanted to test that again. I don't actually have the final results for that, but it was something that we were kind of continuing to monitor. So with those things in mind, the most successful experiment of the three was actually the history limits, which was a very small change, but it turned out that people do want to go back and see their history, and they will upgrade to do it. But it's not enough of a problem that they would churn for it. So, they'll go back, and sometimes they would just upgrade and like, I'll upgrade for a couple of months, I'll have my access, and then I'll downgrade. And it gives that flexibility that people are often looking for, especially on those kind of non-enterprise tiers, which is what we were focusing on for these experiments.
That's so great. And how long did the experiments take in like the entire spectrum of it?
That's tricky. So these were some of the first growth experiments we were actually doing because there wasn't a huge growth rhythm at the company before this. So I'd say it took actually quite a while to implement all of them. And part of the problem was we didn't have the data analysis and A/B testing kind of set up that we had hoped for. And so we were building that as we went. The longest one was actually template limits because we retested that and we made the mistake of releasing a feature change in a similar area at the same time. So we had to untangle the two changes of like which one is impacting the thing. So that actually took like maybe a year to kind of like implement and then also like figure out what's happening as we kind of figured things out. I would say team limits was the quickest because churn is such an easy indicator to see. So we were able to get results from that the quickest, even though it was kind of a lagging indicator. So that was like a couple months. So people took time to kind of get to that point of hitting the limit. And then once we started to see the results of that, we were able to roll it back quite quickly. Meeting history was actually also quick. I didn't design that. A developer designed it and he ran it through me. I did like a couple like branding tweaks kind of thing. And then that was one of the things that we tried to encourage was like developers can have design sense too. And if there's something, an idea they have that's really quick, like let them do it. And I'll just be like, yep, go ahead, cool. And so that was one we were able to release very quickly. And I think we had results a couple months later.
Nice. That's amazing. Wow, this has been really, really awesome. Honestly, I've loved chatting to you. And I can finally say that my fangirl self is satisfied. Thank you. um, no, seriously, thank you for delving into all of these topics. It's been really interesting to listen to your experience, but also just your perspectives on how you've approached being the initial growth designer on a team and also your crossover from product. And we've shared about a lot of things, understanding PLG as a designer and the different kinds of challenges that you can expect and also how to navigate those. So we have come to the part of the episode that we've decided to stop calling like lightning questions because they're never quick enough. But we're just gonna go through them. So all right, so just get to know you questions. That's what we'll call them or something. So what are the top 3 products that you use daily and you love?
The first one that came to mind, because I use it all the time, is Notion. It's just so easy to like have everything written down. Parable did a lot of documentation and it makes it so much easier to have it all in one place, and you can have your databases and all of the things right there. So I'm a big fan of Notion. I also really love Loom. I work on distributed teams, and so Loom is a way for me to share my thought process, especially like in progress work. And it's super helpful to have that space to do it where it doesn't always need to be a sync meeting. You know, I had a developer who's in Russia, and so the time difference was quite large, and Loom really helped us solve that problem. And then when I tried to think of a third, I was like, what else do I do every day? And I think Spotify, of just like having some background music, or now that they have podcasts, I'm definitely using Spotify a lot more for podcasts now. Yeah, it's just, that's the little bit of joy in your day, I think, is having those things.
Yeah. Okay. So what's one design resource that you keep coming back to?
I think there's a Chrome extension called Musely, and it's been out for a long time, but it's something that I go through phases of using it or not using it. But it aggregates tech news and design inspiration and all of these different things. It kind of puts it into one spot. And so I like having access, and I'll go through phases where like I need a bit more of that inspiration and I'll go to that a bit more often, and some phases where I'm like maybe working in a different headspace and I don't need that as much. So it's come and go, but I do keep kind of coming back to that as a space where like it's all in one spot. I don't need to go searching for a ton of different things.
I love that. All right, so what are books that you like to recommend?
Quiet by Susan Cain is not new, and I'm sure a lot of people have read it, but as an introvert, it was like telling me who I was when I read it. But I also wanted extroverts to read it because I'm like, I want you to understand and get it. So that book really helped me like feel more comfortable in who I am and be okay with it. You know, sometimes you feel like being an introvert, it's not normal because extroversion is such a big part of our culture, especially at work. And then a fun one that I read recently is The Apollo Murders by Chris Hadfield. That's fiction, but it's a sci-fi space book written by an actual astronaut. So it's really fun. He gets really technical sometimes, which I think is really interesting. So yeah.
I'll add that to my reading list. Sign me up. But yeah, just to speak a bit about Quiet, I actually read this because of my partner. So yes, I can understand you when you're saying like more extroverts should read it. I agree. I'm a big extrovert, and yeah, it's a good book. I love the way that, it's one thing where for someone who, if you're not the subject of the subject matter, I guess, reading that can also be sort of like unveiling, where for once you're the world of someone else and just seeing the world differently through the eyes. And I think, yeah, I definitely recommend to. Yeah. Okay. So if you were not a group designer, what would you be doing?
The first thing that comes to mind is teaching. And part of that is when I left high school and started thinking about a career, I just was like kind of clueless. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was good at history and English. And I was like, okay, my options with that are I become an author or a teacher. And where I live, there's a lot of teachers where I live. So I was like, and the job options are not great. But I do still go back to teaching because I do stuff like this, and even though I'm an introvert, it's super energizing to be able to like share what I've learned. And that's why I've taken on some growth design coaching as well, because it brings in that aspect that I'm like, oh, I actually really love that teaching and sharing knowledge and seeing others grow. So that's why I'm going to go with teacher for this. I think that's what I'd be doing.
Okay. Do you have a favorite movie?
I don't. This was really tricky. I go back and forth with different genres, and yeah, lately I've been into a lot of like crime and mysteries and stuff like that, so I'll go with a genre instead of a specific movie.
Okay, so what's your favorite genre then?
Yeah, I think mystery and suspense point. I love when it like when it draws you into the story. That's what I love.
Yeah, same here too.
So this has been a really great episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Alicia. And I hope you've had as much fun as we have doing this.
I've loved it. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you. I just want to remind you that if you're a growth designer or an aspiring growth designer, it is definitely recommended for you to find the Growth Designers Co community and join. Just go to growthdesigners.co. It's as straightforward as that. And we look forward to seeing you in the community. And when you do join, please be sure to let us know you joined through the Growth Design podcast. It's always nice to have a good chat. All right. Thank you for joining us for this episode, and we will see you next time. Bye.